In this video, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the role of the Mormons in westward expansion across the Americas. So the previous lesson spent some time talking about the intellectual origins of settling into the West, including things like, of course, the belief in manifest destiny and this idea of American exceptionalism. When we think about the origins of Mormonism, and we think about the role of the Mormon exodus towards migrating into the West, of course, this is a very important conversation to be having. So let's think about this in more detail. Ultimately, this is going to be a conversation that is specifically around a number of key individuals. The first of these individuals is Brigham Young, who was born on the 1st of June 1801 in Whittingham, Vermont, and he would grow up in a devoutly religious family, but was not initially drawn to any one single faith. Young's early adulthood saw him working as a carpenter, a farmer, and other kinds of trades, and when we start to see the decisive turn in his spiritual journey, we get to the point at which we're looking at 1832, when he was introduced to the teachings of the Church of Christ, later known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church. Now, ultimately, there are a few things that we can speak about in relation to Brigham Young. In 1832, Young was baptized into the Latter-day Saints Church. He became a devout follower and soon became a key member of one of Joseph Smith's inner circle. Joseph Smith was, of course, the founder of the Latter-day Saints Church and experienced considerable persecution from both religious and political authorities due to the sort of Mormon unorthodox beliefs. We don't need to know too much about what the belief system was, but the early Mormon community would face quite a significant amount of repeated violence, including the destruction of homes and property, particularly in places like Missouri and Illinois. And so the persecution would culminate in the death of Joseph Smith in 1844 in Illinois, and this leads the church without any kind of clear successor. And ultimately, before his death, Joseph Smith had secretly designated Brigham Young as his successor, though his name did not have the same kind of publicity. The leadership crisis following the murder of Joseph Smith led to a certain amount of political instability among the church, as several factions, within the church started to vie for control. It is from here, then, that we see that there is a clear and distinct move and a migration. One of the most decisive and most defining moments in Mormon history, under specifically Brigham Young's leadership, was the westward migration of the Mormon community. After taking leadership, Young led Mormons on a massive migration to Salt Lake Valley in present-day Utah, which was a move that was driven by partly a desire to escape ongoing persecution, but also partly by the expansion and the sort of getting wrapped up in the belief of westward expansionism. Over the next few years, then, thousands of Mormons traveling in wagon trains made their way westward. The journey was often grueling and fraught with hardships like every other journey to the west, but the Mormon pioneers under Young's leadership would reach Salt Lake Valley on the 24th of July, 1847. And it is here at Salt Lake City that we start to see that Brigham Young firstly declares this is the right place. The area, which was then part of Mexico, offered a certain sense of isolation. It offered a certain sense of freedom from persecution that the Mormons had sought. It was difficult, and it was an inhospitable place to settle, of course. It was quite a high desert with quite limited water sources, but the Mormons saw it as an opportunity to build a new society. Continuing on then, Brigham Young was instrumental in organizing the construction of the first permanent settlement in this area. He would implement a highly organized and effective system of communal living, and the Mormon settlement would then grow quite rapidly, such that by the 1850s, the area became known as the Utah Territory, which was granted to the United States following the Mexican-American War, which we looked at in the previous video. Now, ultimately, In thinking about the influence of the Mormons and Brigham Young, one of the most controversial aspects, of course, of Young's leadership was his endorsement and practice of polygamy within Mormon culture. Brigham Young essentially had multiple wives, so did many of the early Mormon leaders, such as Joseph Smith, and it was considered by many to be a central tenet of Mormonism at the time, and it was defended quite vehemently by a lot of individuals. But this practice led to significant tensions between the Mormons and the US government. So in 1862, for example, the United States passed the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act, which was aimed to try and curb polygamy in the Utah Territory, essentially aiming to try and reduce the influence and impact of Mormonism. Continuing on and thinking about some of the influence that we see of people like Brigham Young, his role in the Utah Territory was not just limited to religious leadership. He was also the head of the Latter-day Saints Church, and he served as the territorial governor for between 1851 and 1858. His political leadership was marked by his strong efforts to establish Mormon control over the region. He built a very strong theocratic system in which the church and the state were tightly intertwined. But his tenure as governor was, of course, not without conflict. A conflict between Mormon settlers and the US government, for example, would escalate into what becomes known as the Utah War. The US government, under President James Buchanan, sent an army to Utah in response to fears of disloyalty and rebellion. And so fundamentally, then, the purpose of thinking about the Mormons within this conversation is we're spending this earlier period thinking about expansion. We're thinking about the expansion of American territory out from the east all the way through the west. And this is brought about by a number of different causes and a number of different factors. Some include this idea of manifest destiny. Some of these include this idea of American exceptionalism. Others sought to move westward to try and set up a new life and to establish a new community. People like the Mormons set up to try and flee persecution, and all of which leads to the same kind of conclusions. They all lead to the expansion westward of these different settlements and these different territories. We can see that Young's leadership helped to establish Salt Lake City as a major urban center, and it also set the foundation for the later growth of the church. The influence of Mormon theology, and particularly Young's role in establishing a theocratic society in Utah, becomes quite a contentious point of debate within the Latter-day Saints Church and broader religious studies. So it's important that we think about the different people who started to go westward and start to think about westward expansion. In the next lesson, we will talk about the gold seekers and the California gold rush that took place beginning in 1849, another group of individuals who sought to expand west for reasons that were not necessarily due to manifest destiny.